702.
World of Work.
How do you protect yourself in the workplace when you picking up some wrong things taking place, like some irregularities, or maybe you witness corruption? How important is making sure that you have paper trail? Like, are you a type of person that starts printing out documents, or you intentionally send an email to the boss to express your unhappiness with how things are being done? What's the best way to do it? How have you done it in the past? I'm asking you that question because on our World of Work feature this morning, we're discussing how to protect ourselves in the workplace, especially when we pick up there are some irregularities. As you've heard from the recent testimonies at the Madlanga Commission, we have been shown the importance of keeping a paper trail in the workplace. Right? Workplace politics put employees under strain, and more South Africans are finding themselves targets of sabotage or misinformation, even quiet campaigns to push them out because they dared stand up against irregularities or corruption. And this is not only limited to corruption, right? Because you've got colleagues that take credit for your work when they're speaking to managers, or maybe they set you up for failure. So as an employee, you increasingly have to think about how to protect yourself in a workplace environment. So knowing what to keep a record of, how to raise concerns right away. And when a workplace dispute becomes a legal matter, like can you even determine whether an employee can successfully defend themselves or loses out on an issue they can't prove? Like, those determinations are important, and knowing what to do also becomes important in order to have yourself protected. I want to know from you this morning if you've ever felt undermined or sabotaged, or you've picked up something weird at work that you wanted to protect yourself against. How did you go about doing that? You can call us or send us a WhatsApp voice note. The number to call 011-883-0702. WhatsApp's on 0727021702. Lerato Shawane is an HR specialist guiding us through this conversation. Thank you for your time, Lerato. Good morning.
Good morning, Clement, and good morning to your listeners.
What does workplace... So let's maybe start with the importance of protecting ourselves. Under what circumstances can employees, think of protecting themselves? Is it, when you're being sabotaged, or you can see you're being set up for failure, or you're picking up some irregularities or corruption in the company, what do you do next in cases like that?
I always encourage employees to always have an understanding of the company policies, especially as far as it relates to, conduct expectations, your disciplinary code and procedure. And also, most organizations will also have what we call a hotline. Understand how all of those processes basically work. And that becomes, a starting point, so that when you start to identify certain symptoms, you're like, what, I think this one is a hotline matter, or this one is a matter that, has to do with this person's conduct. Is the grievance procedure, the right procedure to follow, so that, they're not found, wanting and overwhelmed and surprised. So it's important that we always just start. And I also think from, an employer perspective, socializing, policies and procedures with all employees across the board, and not wait for things, to get to a point where an employee now feels like they've got absolutely no recourse, and it's starting to affect them quite negatively.
Mm-hmm. And why is keeping paper trail so important? Like, what exactly should employees be recording? So as soon as you pick up that something is weird here, whether it's sabotage or you set up for failure or there's some irregularities, must you make your expression very clear of unhappiness, or that you disagree with the position that your division or a company has taken, just so that there is a recorded rejection of whatever has been proposed that you thought is irregular, or would you advise otherwise?
So, a paper trail is quite important, especially because you might find yourself in a situation where, when you're positioning these things verbally, let's say directly with your manager or someone in a senior position, you might find that, they gaslight you. I always say it's important when something happens and you feel uncomfortable with it, document it, so that you also don't forget. Because sometimes it will happen when these things now start getting exacerbated and you're under high stress. You could actually forget the things that have happened previously that actually substantiate your matter. So it's important. I mean, we're in the digital age. So, emails, keeping memos and things of, things that actually happen as things progress is quite critical and important.
Yeah. What's the right way to document a workplace incident without coming across as paranoid or even accusatory? Because many employees will tell you how scared they are to even approach HR because, they'll say, yeah, sure, HR is supposed to represent me, but what if I'm going there to actually complain against my boss and that HR boss's boss is also my boss? So who do you trust? What's the best way to record this without coming across as just paranoid and accusatory?
Always state the facts. Note the date, note the incident, note who did what, and also how that incident actually made you feel. And I always encourage people to always go back also to the policies, the code of conduct. If someone speaks to you in a certain tone or, they use inflammatory language, you can always just, document it to say, on this day, I was sitting in a meeting with a client. My colleague ended up saying certain things that are in contravention of the company's values. And also our legislation in this country protects us from being discriminated against or being harmed, whether it is physical or, psychological in the workplace. And you can use that to also further substantiate your concerns when you're documenting them.
Mm-hmm. And what about rumors that are being spread or misinformation in the company? So if a colleague or manager is spreading rumors or misinformation, what does recourse look like for an employee?
So recourse for an employee can be in a number of ways. Firstly, if you are comfortable enough to address it with the employee concerned, you can also do that. But if you feel that it needs to take a formal process, any number of ways where you can escalate it to your manager, escalate it to HR, and if it is not being resolved, a grievance procedure. I've found that a grievance procedure is a good formal way of getting some of these things resolved, because then there is a trail where you lodge the grievance and your employer has to deal with the grievance by a certain amount of time. And the outcome also needs to be documented so that you are also protected against retaliation and all of these things, to say, guys, this person might be behaving this way because I have raised a grievance with them that is dated such and such a date, so that it also protects you going forward.
Yeah, so it's important to always back up whatever you've expressed with a written summary email, just so that you're able to produce that much later. But at what point does a workplace conflict move from an internal issue to a legal one now?
Yeah, employees will exhaust internal avenues, and internal avenues might be you escalated to the leadership, the executive, nothing gets done. You follow a grievance procedure. I've had instances where employees have felt that, I've exhausted the internal avenues, or I don't feel protected, internally. And they will then go externally, either through, labor unions. I found that, some employees that have access to a union will refer that matter to say, I just need to be supported. And employers will then, take it up and say, this is actually serious, because now they realize that it is no longer an internal issue, and they stand to basically, get their reputation affected externally.
True. 011-883-0702 is the number to dial if you want to share your experience with us. Have you ever felt maybe undermined or sabotaged or set up at work? How did you protect yourself, and what did you learn from that experience? And I want to know from some of you that have also picked up some irregularities, or maybe there's some corruption, or processes were not followed in your workplace. How did you express your dissatisfaction with that? Is it a matter you took to HR? Did you simply just um, make sure you've got paper trails, so you backing everything up, any discussion, you backing that with emails to make sure that it's very clear where the instruction came from, or it's clear that you are not in support of a particular process. How have you done it? And did it work out for you, or did that land you in trouble? How do you protect yourself against, well, a number of things? Maybe sabotage, maybe someone is trying to set you up for failure, or maybe you have picked up some irregularities. Maybe you're a whistleblower in your workplace and you wanted to make sure that the bosses or whoever is going to investigate that matter later will know that you expressed your dissatisfaction with the processes that were being followed, or with the violation of the regulations or the law. How do you protect yourself at work when you're picking up some things that are weird? Do you approach HR? Do you put that on paper just so that in future you are protected? You are able to bring that as evidence to back up the claim, your claims. How do you do it? We're speaking to Lerato Shawane, who's an HR specialist. I want to hear from you now. So let's start with your WhatsApps that are coming on 0727021702.
Hi, Clement, and your visitor. I would like to remain anonymous. Clement, there was a time when I reported a wrongdoing by the other manager to my manager. I gathered all information, took pictures, and so on and so forth. This other manager used to come for hearing and hearing and hearing. And I told my manager, please, don't divulge my name. But in the end, I hear that my name was divulged, and it was never nice for me. And people wanted to know, why did you do this, then so on and so on. It was never nice. Thank you.
Mm. That's not cool at all. Lerato, in that case, then what do you do then as an employee if you blew the whistle on a former manager or current one, and your identity that then gets revealed?
It's always heartbreaking when you walk into an organization and you're told that people are protected, and we must report any wrongdoing that we see. And then more often than not, I mean, we've had my HR circle and we've had so many people that have come to us and said, guys, but we're not being protected. And in that instance, I mean, the employer has an obligation in terms of the Protected Disclosures Act to protect, their employees. And this is where more often than not, employees will feel that if I'm not protected internally, I'm actually going to, refer this matter externally. In other organizations, you will have an employee that feels like they are experiencing retaliation as a result of a disclosure that they've made, who will then write to either shareholders or board members, and it does get addressed. In other instances, if like the gentleman on the voice note said that he followed the process where he informed his manager, if there is a hotline, I always encourage to use the hotline, because even us as HR will not have access to it. There will be a process that is followed to ensure that that is dealt with and the employee is protected, especially from retaliation, which we're seeing more and more often. And it really, honestly, it is such a sad state of circumstances to see.
So how do you address retaliation? If there is retaliation that comes as a result of you blowing the whistle, and maybe they didn't reveal your name publicly, but maybe whoever you sent that whistleblower report to informed maybe the person you're complaining about. Let's say it happens to be the COO or CEO of the organization, and then suddenly you see you are slowly being, not being invited to important meetings, you're sidelined or you get fired. Is there recourse for you, or you must be able to prove that these actions came because you blew the whistle?
So you must be able to prove that, the behavior and conduct of the people that you reported started to change. And this is where also the paper trail that we discussed earlier comes in. Start documenting those things. And, if you're in a position to, escalate that issue to the board or shareholders or people who are more senior than, and I'll use the word loosely, the perpetrators, I always recommend that this is done. But the hotline, which is a culture that most public and private institutions have, is established to deal precisely with those instances, especially because when you are making a complaint or a disclosure against a person that is very senior in the organization, there might be an abuse of power to try and cover that up. And this is where, the hotline, comes in and protects people that have these kinds of disclosures to basically make.
Yeah. Okay. Some texts that are coming through on the WhatsApp line now. Who's this? Anonymous says, "Hi Clement. I would like to remain anonymous. Listening to your guest Lerato talking about how documenting, following grievance procedures, or consulting with HR practitioners may protect an employee in their hour of need. I have learned after my own unfair dismissal that the only thing which carries weight in the workplace is PR mileage. I worked for an institute which prided itself in being the vanguard of rules and integrity, but when it came to the crunch time, once the directors had decided that I should be out, there wasn't enough truth or evidence which protected me, including the CCMA. So even with the Madlanga Commission, it was only after it came into the public domain that we are beginning to see justice for people who were aggrieved. Imagine these people and the law, and whether or not the law was on their side. But then it didn't matter. They were still victimized too, even with the law on their side. That's a message there from Anonymous, Lerato. And I think to an extent, Anonymous does make a fair point. There are people who will endure the abuse. The only time really that you get the matter being given close attention and maybe hopefully pressure as well for the company to follow its rules and not act out of emotion because you blew the whistle is only if you have somehow leaked it or you've publicized it somewhere or it's been spoken about somewhere publicly and you've got people that can put pressure. So the point there is the processes at work then sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes they're not going to be sufficient to protect you.
That is very true. And I mean, what we've seen at, Madlanga, at the Madlanga Commission has also, us as HR professionals has actually made us now realize that, there's actually more that needs to be done. And as, the listeners also said, sometimes you just need to, go out there and blow the whistle. We've had instances where, people have posted on LinkedIn to say, guys, I've done this. I've got no other recourse except to make this matter public. And unfortunately, it always breaks my heart that we always have to get to that point. But people also have an obligation to protect themselves, especially when they feel like psychologically they are being abused, and also just their well-being in the place of work, which is where we spend most of our time.
Absolutely. Lerato, thank you so much for guiding us through this chat and helping us understand, just the minor, small things we can do in the beginning to protect ourselves in the workplace. Lerato Shawane is an HR specialist.